Picture yourself as an American, scrolling through YouTube late at night. You click on a Cold War story expecting missiles, spies, maybe footage of parades in Red Square. Instead, the screen opens on a cramped Soviet apartment, a bare kitchen table, and a family huddled around a single sheet of paper written in shaky Russian. It's an application to leave the Soviet Union. It's just a form, but in that system, mailing it is almost an act of war. The father has a cousin in Brooklyn he's never met. The mother has an aunt in Tel Aviv who survived the camps. They've heard rumors that if you can prove family reunification, maybe, just maybe, you can get permission to go. They also know what happens to people who try and fail. They lose their jobs, their kids are watched, their names go into KGB files under politically unreliable. They sign anyway. They mail the form, they wait. Weeks later, the answer comes back stamped in hard red ink. Refused. It's one word, but it changes everything. They are no longer just Soviet Jews. They are refuseniks, people who asked to leave and were told, in effect, that the state owns their lives. In the 1960s and 1970s, thousands of Soviet Jews, imagine you're an American, sitting at home, clicking on a Cold War video. You expect missiles, parades in Red Square, maybe grainy footage of Reagan and Gorbachev. Instead, the story begins in a cramped Soviet apartment, with a family huddled around a kitchen table, wondering if they dare do something almost unthinkable. They are thinking about asking to leave, not just to move to another city, not just to change jobs, to leave the Soviet Union completely. For Jews in the USSR, that one decision could change everything. To you, that might sound simple. You fill out a form, you apply for a visa. In the Soviet system, it was closer to lighting a fuse. Once you submitted that application, the state knew you wanted out. Your boss would soon know, the local party committee would know, the KGB would know. And from that moment, in the eyes of the system, you were no longer just a citizen. You were a potential traitor. The Soviets called their ideology scientific socialism. They claimed to understand how history worked, how nations rose and fell, how religion and nationalism would eventually disappear. Yet here, in thousands of apartments from Riga to Tbilisi, one group of people, Soviet Jews, were quietly challenging that script, and doing it by trying to walk out the door. Tonight, this is their story. And it is also a story about how transnational Jewish networks, the State of Israel, American law, and Western refugee organizations built a kind of underground railroad in plain sight, one that made Soviet officials realize that their carefully controlled world was far more porous than they wanted to believe. It is a story where the weapons are not tanks and bombers, but exit visas, airline routes, legal amendments, UN treaties, and refugee pipelines engineered with almost industrial precision. And for Americans watching, it offers the same mix of pride, fascination, and disbelief you see in World War II documentaries, where German officers talk about being overwhelmed by U.S. production. Only here, the battleground is people, paperwork, and the right to leave. Let's start where it mattered most, inside the Soviet Union. To understand why Jewish escape routes had to be built, you need to see the wall they were pushing against. From the outside, the USSR presented itself as a workers' state, where citizens had no reason to leave. Emigration was portrayed as a betrayal. In practice, almost everyone was locked in by a system of internal passports and external exit visas. For Soviet Jews, there was another layer. They were recognized as a distinct nationality on their internal documents, with Jew listed on the fifth line of the passport. They knew about the Holocaust, about relatives who had been killed. They read between the lines of Soviet newspapers when Israel fought its wars. Many faced unofficial quotas in universities, glass ceilings in careers, and daily anti-Semitism. Now, imagine you're a Jewish engineer or physicist in Leningrad in the late 1960s. You hear that under international pressure, the Soviet Union has started allowing some Jews to emigrate, usually to Israel, under the pretext of family reunification. Friends whisper that it might be possible if you have the right invitations, if you are willing to lose your job, if you can withstand the attention of the KGB. You talk with your family. You weigh the risks, your child's future, your aging parents, your career, your patriotism. And one day, you decide. You walk into the local OVIR office, the bureaucratic gatekeeper for visas, and you apply to leave. With that one act, you step into a different category. If the answer is yes, you will, after months of uncertainty, become part of a carefully managed outflow of people the Soviet state wants gone: Jews, ethnic Germans, Armenians, and others, officially reconnected with relatives abroad. If the answer is no, you become something entirely else. You become a refusenik. Refusenik was never an official word in Soviet law. It was a piece of dark humor, born from the stamped refusal on exit applications. But over time, it became the name of a movement. Refuseniks were men and women who had applied for permission to emigrate and were rejected, often on the grounds that they had once worked in sensitive positions or had access to state secrets, even if their work had been years or decades in the past. For them, the price of asking was immediate and brutal. They lost their jobs or were demoted. They were labeled disloyal. Their kids saw doors close at universities. Their apartments were bugged. Neighbors started to avoid them knowing the KGB was watching. In theory, the Soviet system claimed to protect workers. In reality, it used your job as a leash. If you became a refusenik, you often ended up doing menial labor, stoker, janitor, or night guard, if you found any legal work at all. And yet, tens of thousands of Jews chose that path. Why? Because they did not just want better food or a bigger apartment. They wanted something the system was not designed to give: the freedom to live openly as Jews, to speak Hebrew, to go to Israel if they chose, or to rebuild their lives somewhere beyond the reach of Soviet ideology. Inside the Soviet Union, that determination took on a very particular shape. Refuseniks organized Hebrew classes in apartments, taught Jewish history underground, and built small networks of mutual aid and information. They learned how to fill out documents, what to expect from interrogations, how to get their stories to Western journalists and diplomats. From the Soviet state's point of view, this was a disturbing phenomenon. People who were supposed to be Soviet citizens first and nothing else were quietly behaving like a distinct transnational community plugged into a world beyond the Iron Curtain. For outsiders, especially in Israel and the West, this was the starting point for something much bigger: a multi-layered escape system. On the Israeli side, the bridge to Soviet Jews had a code name. It was called Nativ, the Path. Officially, it was the Liaison Bureau, Lishkat HaKesher, created in 1952 and tucked under the Prime Minister's office in Jerusalem. Its job was simple to describe and hard to execute: keep the connection alive between Israel and Jews trapped behind the Iron Curtain. Nativ didn't operate like a normal embassy department. Its officers worked out of Israeli missions in Moscow and Eastern European capitals, sometimes at odds with cautious diplomats who worried about provoking the Soviets. They carried Israeli passports, but their work looked more like a blend of cultural diplomacy and low-level espionage. From the point of view of the KGB, Nativ agents were exactly what the Cold War playbook warned about: operatives from a foreign, hostile state using ethnic and religious ties to undermine loyalty to Moscow. In internal reports, they appeared as a persistent irritant, feeding a sense of Jewish national identity the regime worked hard to suppress. But Nativ alone could not move people. For that, Israel and Jewish communities needed something else: a pipeline that began in Soviet stations and ended on tarmacs in Tel Aviv, New York, or Sydney. That's where Western Jewish organizations came in. To Americans, some of the names may sound familiar from other historical episodes. HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, had been moving Jewish refugees for generations, from Ellis Island days onward. The American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, or JDC, had spent the 20th century feeding and housing Jews in war zones and displaced persons camps across Europe and beyond. When the Soviet Union finally opened the door just enough to let some Jews escape, these organizations were ready. They turned one Central European capital into the main junction of a modern underground railroad, Vienna. From the late 1960s into the 1980s, a fairly standard route emerged. It was simple on paper and complex in reality. Step 1. A Soviet Jew, or a family, secured an exit visa, usually on the basis of family reunification with a relative in Israel. Step 2. They boarded a train, often traveling through Ukraine and then Czechoslovakia, toward the Austrian border. Step 3. They crossed at a place like Marchegg, leaving the Soviet sphere and stepping, often in disbelief, into neutral Austria. There, on the platform, representatives of the Jewish Agency for Israel, Sochnut, were waiting. They spoke Russian and Hebrew. They carried clipboards and lists. They shepherded exhausted families onto another train bound for Vienna, to a world that smelled like coffee and diesel and freedom. In Vienna, the Jewish Agency did something crucial and very fast. It asked each new arrival a single, fateful question: will you go to Israel? If the answer was yes, the Jewish Agency moved with startling speed. Sometimes within 24 hours, certainly within a few days, those families were put on flights to Tel Aviv. For someone who had spent years as a refusenik under KGB pressure, the contrast was dizzying. Soviet bureaucracy on one side, Israeli and Jewish agency logistics on the other, built to move people as quickly as possible. If the answer was no, if the family wanted to go to the United States, Canada, Australia, or somewhere else, that's when Hayes and JDC stepped in. Hayes counselors told them about refugee law and quotas. JDC staff arranged temporary housing, food, medical care, schooling for kids. Then came the second leg of the journey, the train to Rome. Italy had become the primary Western processing point for Soviet Jews headed to countries other than Israel. Consulates in Rome and nearby cities took refugee applications. The cost of living was lower than in Austria, and perhaps most importantly, the system was already in place. Hotels, hostels, rented apartments, even seaside townhouses around Ostia turned into semi-permanent way stations for Soviet Jews in transit. If you had walked those streets in the 1970s and 1980s, you would have heard Russian and Ukrainian spoken on balconies and in grocery shops, seen children of refuseniks playing soccer on Italian beaches, watched JDC social workers juggling files and food vouchers. By the time this pipeline reached its full scale, Hayes estimates that more than 400,000 Jews from the former Soviet Union passed through Vienna alone, many of them moving on through Rome en route to North America and other Western countries. JDC, Hayes, and the Jewish Agency, supported by local Jewish federations in cities like New York, Chicago, Toronto, and Melbourne, orchestrated this movement like a long, complex relay race. From the Soviet side, this was astonishing. They released a few thousand or tens of thousands of Jews a year, hoping perhaps that it would ease pressure. Instead, they watched those people disappear into a well-oiled machine that funneled them straight into Israel's demographics, America's Jewish communities, and the broader Western world. The Soviets prided themselves on planned economies and 5-year plans, but here was a different kind of planning, a transnational refugee logistics network that could receive people at the exact moment they stepped off a Soviet train, interview them, assign them a destination, feed and house them, and get them on a plane, backed by Western money and often American immigration law. If German generals had once stared at American assembly lines in disbelief, Soviet analysts now stared at this humanitarian assembly line and realized that when it came to moving people, their system was hopelessly outmatched. Of course, this was not just an operational story, it was also a political one. In Washington, lawmakers looked at Soviet Jews and saw more than a humanitarian case. They saw leverage. In 1974, the United States passed the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, attaching human rights conditions to trade benefits for non-market economies like the USSR. On paper, it was simple. If a communist country restricted the right of its citizens to emigrate, it would not receive most favored nation tariff status or certain export credits from the U.S. In practice, it sent a message straight to Moscow. If you want better access to our markets and technology, you have to let more of your people, including Jews, leave. American Jewish organizations were deeply involved in drafting and pushing Jackson-Vanik. They framed Soviet Jewish emigration as a test of the USSR's willingness to respect basic human rights. From the Soviet perspective, this was infuriating. Here was the United States using its economic and technological superiority, its role of the gatekeeper of advanced goods and credits, as a tool to pry open the Iron Curtain. Historians still debate exactly how much Jackson-Vanik changed the numbers year by year, but what is clear is that, over time, it embedded the fate of Soviet Jews into broader East-West negotiations. Trade, arms control, computer exports, all of it was shadowed by questions about exit visas and refuseniks. For a regime that liked to think it controlled the narrative, this was a rude shock. The same industrial and financial strength that had overwhelmed Nazi Germany was now being repurposed through congressional law and grassroots lobbying to challenge Soviet policy on something as intimate as who was allowed to leave their homeland. Meanwhile, on the streets of Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, and dozens of other cities, Soviet Jews were doing something that no Kremlin directive could fully stop: organizing themselves. They traded tips on how to deal with OVIR. They held underground Hebrew classes to prepare for life in Israel. They gathered in apartments to celebrate Jewish holidays quietly, with newspapers shoved against the window panes to block prying eyes. Some wrote letters to the United Nations, to Western leaders, to Jewish organizations abroad. Others maintained regular contact with visitors, tourists, academics, even Western communists, slipping them documents, names, and requests to be delivered outside the Soviet censorship system. In London, New York, and Jerusalem, those messages were received, translated, and amplified. Campaigns to save Soviet Jewry sprang up on college campuses and in synagogues. Families adopted refuseniks, wrote letters, marched in front of Soviet embassies, pushed their own governments to raise specific cases in summits. For the KGB, this created a new headache. It was not just that some Jews wanted to leave, it was that their names, their stories, their photos, sometimes snapped on clandestine cameras and smuggled out, were appearing in Western newspapers and on American television. Every time that happened, it became harder to quietly crush them. Beating or jailing a refusenik whose name was known to U.S. senators or British MPs carried a diplomatic cost. In this sense, Jewish escape routes were not only physical, they were informational. Families who would later take the train to Vienna first had to escape a different prison, the one that said, "No one knows you, no one will ever hear what happens to you." By the late 1980s, that illusion had been shattered. The Soviet Union remained a formidable military power, but when it came to controlling the movement of ideas and people, it was constantly on the defensive. Then came Gorbachev, perestroika, glasnost, and a sudden loosening of the bolts. Under pressure from economic crisis, diplomatic isolation, and internal demands for reform, Soviet authorities began lifting many of the restrictions on emigration. Exit visas that had once been almost impossible now started to be approved in large numbers. What followed has been called the Soviet Jewish exodus. In the space of a few years, what had been a trickle became a flood. Israel saw roughly 1 million Jews from the former Soviet Union arrive between the mid-1970s and the 1990s, with the largest wave in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Hundreds of thousands more headed to the United States and other Western countries, many still passing through Vienna and Rome, but increasingly also using new routes. This is where the story takes one more turn that would have made Soviet planners grind their teeth.
the airlift operations through Eastern Europe.
Even as the Soviet Union relaxed internal controls, it still had foreign policy constraints. Direct, large-scale flights from Soviet airports to Israel were politically sensitive, given Moscow's ties with Arab states. So the escape routes had to bend again. In Central Europe, several post-communist states saw an opportunity. Hungary was one of the first. By 1989, its communist-era government was already experimenting with reforms and looking west. It opened a commercial airlink between Budapest and Tel Aviv through its national airline, Malev, mainly to earn hard currency. Israeli officials and representatives of the Jewish Agency quickly realized what this could mean. Hungary agreed to serve as a bridge. Tens of thousands of Soviet Jews would travel by train or bus to Budapest, stay briefly, and then board Malev flights to Israel. Between March 1989 and January 1992, roughly 160,000 Soviet Jews used this route. Hungarian airports became scenes that looked more like World War II airlifts than routine commercial operations. Lines of families with Soviet passports and Israeli visas processed by hastily improvised desks staffed by multilingual officials and aid workers. Poland played a similar role in an operation known as Operation Bridge. As it transitioned away from communism, Poland allowed its territory and transport network to serve as a corridor for Jews leaving the USSR and heading to Israel, offering another path in case the Hungarian route came under threat. Romania, which had long maintained its own idiosyncratic ties with both Israel and the Arab world, also intermittently acted as a transit point, with flights via Bucharest. Further north, Christian Zionist organizations worked with the Jewish Agency to move Jews from Leningrad/St. Petersburg by bus through Finland to airports where they could catch flights to Israel. Each of these operations required coordination across governments, airlines, security services, and humanitarian agencies. Each one ran up against potential threats, from terrorism to pressure by states hostile to Israel. And each one showcased something the Soviet system had always struggled with: flexible, cross-border cooperation between state and non-state actors, moving quickly in response to opportunity. For decades, Soviet planners had thought in terms of blocking and channeling movement, shutting borders, redirecting internal migrations, assigning workers to where the plan needed them. Now, they were watching as newly independent or reforming neighbors, aided by Israel and Western NGOs, turned their own territory into launch pads for the very exodus Moscow had tried so hard to prevent. Once again, the comparison with World War II is hard to resist. Where German generals once misjudged the flexibility and speed of American logistics, Soviet and ex-Soviet officials were now realizing that, in the realm of people and planes, their old tools were almost obsolete. By the time the dust settled, Jewish escape routes from the USSR changed the global Jewish map. Israel gained roughly 1 million new citizens from the former Soviet Union, reshaping its politics, economy, and culture. The United States, Canada, Australia, and other Western countries saw hundreds of thousands of Soviet Jewish refugees arrive through the Vienna-Rome corridor and later through more direct channels, many assisted by HIAS and JDC. Germany, once the epicenter of Jewish destruction, became home to a significant new Russian-speaking Jewish community due to post-Soviet migration policies. Inside the former USSR, Jewish life did not disappear, it reconfigured. Smaller communities remained in Russia, Ukraine, and other successor states, often supported by the same international organizations that at once helped people leave. Looking back, what stands out is not just the numbers, it is the architecture of the system that made those numbers possible.
On one layer, you have families in Soviet apartments making the most personal of choices under immense pressure. On another, you have refuseniks networks passing around phone numbers, teaching Hebrew, sharing courage. On a higher layer, you have Nativ and the Jewish Agency, acting as Israel's extended hand into a world where it officially had almost no access. Then, HIAS and JDC and Western federations turning cities like Vienna and Rome into finely tuned transit hubs for human lives. Above it all, you have American law and politics, with measures like Jackson-Vanik tying the USSR's access to Western markets and technology to its treatment of people who wanted to leave. From the Soviet perspective, this stacked system must have looked like a kind of soft power machine. Multiple gears, legal, diplomatic, humanitarian, religious, spinning in sync around a single issue. Each time they tried to seize one gear, the others kept turning. For Americans, there's a particular kind of pride in that. Not the pride of having more tanks or bigger bombs, but the pride of seeing how your country's economic weight, legal innovation, and civil society helped squeeze open a closed society, not by invading it, but by giving its own citizens somewhere to go and a way to get there. It's the pride of knowing that a piece of U.S. legislation written in the 1970s could decades later still be referenced in Kremlin debates about limiting emigration was worth the cost in trade and technology. It's the pride of seeing American-funded organizations in Vienna and Rome take people whose names once appeared in KGB files and turn them into niggers in Brooklyn, Boston, and Los Angeles. And it's the fascination of realizing that in the great Cold War contest between two systems, one of the most decisive battlegrounds was, in the end, this simple question: if someone wants to leave, can they? Soviet power said no, or only on its own harsh terms. Jewish communities, Israel, and the West spent decades building an answer that, step by step, train by train, plane by plane, turned into yes.